In war, victories were not born in the sky. They began on the ground, beneath the wings of aircraft that had yet to take flight. There, among puddles of oil, scattered wrenches, and the constant hiss of compressors, stood men in grease-stained coveralls who never appeared in newspapers or newsreels. Their hands were cracked from cold and fuel, their uniforms stiff with frost. Yet every bolt they tightened carried the weight of lives depending on it. On the airfields of Britain in the winter of 1944, their world was a choreography of motion and noise, illuminated by the dim yellow glow of lamps swinging in the wind. At RAF Ridgewell, a base carved into the field of Essex, the night never truly ended. The air vibrated with the low hum of generators and the clank of metal against metal. This was home to the 381st Bombardment Group of the United States 8th Air Force, men who had been flying deep into occupied Europe since the summer of 1943. The base was a small city of mud, aluminum, and discipline, where hundreds of ground crew worked without pause so that others could fly. They lived in Nissen huts, ate in hurried silence, and carried the fatigue of 1,000 takeoffs in their shoulders. By February 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its breaking point. The German aircraft industry was still producing fighters faster than the Allies could destroy them, and the U.S. command had decided on a massive coordinated assault that would later be known as Big Week. For the 381st, it meant a week of continuous missions, multiple launches per day, minimal rest, and no margin for mechanical failure. Every engine had to start on time. Every bomber had to leave the runway in formation. One leaking fuel line could ground an aircraft and unravel an entire strike plan that stretched from Essex to Saxony. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Frost covered the wings like a thin shell of glass. Crews moved between aircraft with flashlights, their breath hanging in the air as they checked hydraulic lines, magnetos, and ignition circuits. Inside the hangars, the smell of aviation gasoline mixed with hot oil and exhaust. There was no glamour here, no speeches or flags, only the rhythm of work that repeated itself before every dawn. The men knew that when the sun rose, 20 B-17 flying fortresses would have to be ready to climb into the pale sky and vanish toward Germany. The Flying Fortress was a masterpiece of American engineering, but even masterpieces faltered under the strain of war. A single B-17 contained more than 200 feet of fuel tubing, dozens of valves, and a network of seals that could fail after one rough landing or a night of frost. The ground crews learned to hear problems before they saw them. A faint hiss beneath the wing, a flicker of uneven pressure, a smell sharp enough to slice through the cold. On that particular morning, one mechanic caught it, a trace of fuel in the air that did not belong there. Somewhere beneath the left wing, gasoline was seeping through a joint no thicker than a finger. There was no panic, only the quiet urgency that came from routine. The mechanic signaled for the engine to remain shut down. He slid under the fuselage, his tools clinking against the frozen concrete. Above him loomed the vast silhouette of the bomber, its skin streaked with frost and oil stains. The others kept moving between aircraft, shouting numbers, checking gauges, measuring fuel levels. Time was running out. Within the hour, the roar of 20 aircraft would have a roll across Ridgewell's runways, and this single machine could not be the one to hold them back. Around the perimeter, searchlights swept across the fields. The horizon glowed faintly from nearby villages still under blackout. In the control tower, officers studied maps and weather reports, but down below, the true battle was being fought against seconds and mental fatigue. Every screw turned in that darkness carried a kind of faith that the engines would catch, that the wings would hold, that all the invisible work done in silence would keep men alive 10 miles above the earth. When the first engines finally coughed life, the sound was not triumph but relief. The ground trembled as propellers spun, and exhaust plumes rippled in the cold air. The men stepped back, shielding their faces from a blast. They did not wave or cheer. They simply watched as the fortresses began to move toward the runway, one after another, their navigation lights blinking like distant stars. For most, the work was already over. Their battle had been fought in grease and shadow, hours before the bombers reached the sky. And somewhere under the wing of one of those aircraft, a mechanic wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the dark patch where the leak had been. The fix had held. The mission could go on. The victory of the morning had started in that small moment. Quiet, uncelebrated, and utterly essential. By February 1944, the air war over Europe had entered its most punishing phase. The American 8th Air Force, based across the English countryside, was launching missions almost every day, striking deep into the heart of Germany. Targets such as Leipzig, Oschersleben, and Regensburg had become familiar names to every crewman, whispered in briefing rooms under the dim glow of red lamps. The relentless pace pushed both men and machines to the edge. Aircraft designed for a few sorties per month were now flying multiple times per week, sometimes returning from one mission only to be rearmed and refuel for another before nightfall. The British winter made everything worse. Cold winds swept across the runways at Ridgewell, carrying sleet and fine ice that crept into every hinge and cable. Aluminum panels expanded and contracted until they cracked. Rubber hoses stiffened and split. Hydraulic fluid thickened in the cold, making controls sluggish. Oil congealed in lines meant to flow freely. Even the tough, riveted skin of the B-17 developed hairline fractures from a combination of vibration, altitude stress, and freezing temperatures. The airfields of England became graveyards of spare parts, where mechanics worked by lantern light to replace what the cold and fatigue had destroyed. Every bomber returning from Germany bore new scars. Flak holes pocked the wings and fuselage. Control cables were frayed from shrapnel. Oxygen systems leaked after being torn by fragments of steel. Crews stumbled from the aircraft shaking with exhaustion, while ground personnel climbed aboard before the engines had even cooled. Their task was to make the impossible routine, to turn wrecks into airworthy machines in a matter of hours. The next morning, the same aircraft had to rise again, ready to fly another 1,000 miles through anti-aircraft fire. For the ground crews, there was no rotation, no furlough, and no time to recover. Unlike pilots, they rarely received decorations. Their world was a continuous shift between dusk and dawn, their sleep broken by the sound of engines roaring back to life. They ate standing up, drank cold coffee in the hangars, and moved from one machine to the next like surgeons in an endless emergency. Many of them were only in their 20s, but months of work without rest had aged them beyond their years. Their hands were always cut and stained, their uniforms stiff with oil. Fuel was the most dangerous element they worked with. High-octane aviation gasoline, known as 100-octane fuel, was extremely volatile. A single spark could destroy not just an airplane, but an entire maintenance bay. Regulations were strict. No open flames, no smoking within 100 feet, and constant grounding of the aircraft to discharge static electricity. Yet the pressure of operations often forced repairs to be done under conditions that barely met safety standards. A tiny leak in a line could not wait until morning. It had to be fixed immediately, because one grounded aircraft could throw off the carefully balanced formation of a bombing mission. Each squadron depended on every aircraft lifting off together. The crews faced another invisible enemy: time. Each mission demanded exact coordination. Weather windows, navigation schedules, and escort rendezvous left no room for delay. If a bomber missed its takeoff slot, the entire strike group risked scattering in the sky, turning disciplined formations into chaos. Commanders demanded readiness, and readiness meant speed. To fall behind was to fail the mission. In this unforgiving rhythm, mistakes would be fatal, but hesitation could be worse. Fatigue became a constant companion. Frostbite and fuel burns were common injuries. Mechanics wrapped rags around their fingers to protect them from freezing metal, but the cold still seeped through. When they leaned into the engine bays, the smell of gasoline filled their lungs, and the vibration of the airframe seemed to enter their bones. Yet they kept moving, because every delay was counted in lives, not minutes. By the time February's big week began, the airfields of the 8th Air Force resembled battlefronts in their own right. The bombers were the weapons, but the mechanics were the soldiers who loaded, repaired, and sustained them. The enemy was not visible here. It was corrosion, where exhaustion and weather, each leaking valve, each frozen joint, each broken line threatened to undo months of planning and thousands of miles of flight. In this struggle, there were no headlines or medals, only the quiet conviction that every properly tightened bolt could save 10 men somewhere above the clouds. At Ridgewell, as across dozens of other bases. The problem was not courage or morale. It was endurance. Machines could be replaced, but the men who kept them flying were finite. They fought not with guns or with wrenches, fighting a war measured in hours of sleep lost and missions kept alive. And as the bombers thundered down the runway toward the heart of Germany, their unseen victory had already been won by those who refused to let fatigue, frost, or fear ground them. RAF Ridgewell lay in the flat farmlands of Essex, its runways cut into the soil like scars left by the machinery of war. What had once been quiet English countryside became, by 1943, one of the most vital hubs of the American 8th Air Force. The 381st Bombardment Group Heavy arrived there in June of that year, bringing with it the deep metallic roar of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses. The group's 4 squadrons, the 532nd, 533rd, 534th, and 535th, spread across the airfield in neat rows of silver aircraft, each marked by a triangle L on its tail. From this base, they would fly more than 250 missions before the war ended. The 381st was part of the 8th Air Force's growing campaign of daylight precision bombing, an ambitious and perilous strategy meant to cripple Germany's industrial heart. It was a concept forged from both confidence and necessity. Strike the factories that built aircraft, ball bearings, fuel refineries, and rail yards, and the enemy's war machine would collapse. The idea was sound on paper, but in 1943, it was a deadly gamble in the air. Without long-range fighter escorts, formations of B-17s faced waves of German fighters and walls of flak. The losses were devastating. Crews who left Ridgewell at dawn often did not return by evening. Despite the risk, the 381st earned its place in history through persistence and precision. Its first mission struck targets in occupied France and the Netherlands, rail junctions, airfields, and coastal defenses that prepared the way for the coming Allied invasion. As the months passed, the group pushed deeper into the continent, flying to Schweinfurt, Kassel, and Bremen. On October 10, 1943, its aircraft joined the now famous raid on Munster, an operation remembered as one of the bloodiest days for American bombers in Europe. The sky over the city became a storm of flak bursts and smoke. Entire formations vanished. Of the hundreds of bombers dispatched that day, many never made it home. Ridgewell's runways were lined with empty revetments when night fell. Still, the group continued to fly. Training, discipline, and the skill of both air and ground personnel allowed Ridgewell's fortresses to keep returning to the fight. By January 1944, they were seasoned veterans of the air campaign. On the 11th of that month, the 381st took part in the strike against Oschersleben and Halberstadt, targets central to Germany's fighter production. The attack was a success, though the cost was high, and the group's accuracy under heavy fire earned it the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest collective honors awarded to any bomber unit in Europe. When February came, Ridgewell's activity reached its peak. The airfield became a city of restless energy. Operations rooms were lit through the night as officers planned the sequence of raids that would define what came to be known as Big Week. It was a campaign designed to deliver a decisive blow to the Luftwaffe, to destroy not only factories, but also the fighter units that defended them. Between February 20th and 25th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched more than 3,500 heavy bombers in coordinated assaults across Germany. The 381st was among them, flying missions to Leipzig, Bernburg, and Oschersleben. On the ground, Ridgewell transformed into a hive of preparation. Floodlights illuminated rows of B-17s as crews worked through the dark, loading bombs, inspecting engines, and topping off the tanks with volatile 100-octane fuel. Armament specialists calibrated the bomb racks. Gunners cleaned their Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Navigators checked their maps under the flicker of lanterns. Mechanics crawled beneath engines and along wings, kneeling in the mud to replace seals, bolts, and worn spark plugs. Every corner of the base pulsed with movement. Even the mess hall operated through the night, feeding men who rotated in and out of shifts too long to count. The contrast between calm English villages and the relentless noise of the base was striking. Locals could hear the rumble of aircraft long before dawn and feel the ground shake as each squadron roared down the runway. At the edge of the fields, hedgerows trembled from the backwash of propellers. Yet, within the base, There was no time to admire the sight. To the ground crews, those engines meant deadlines. To the airmen, they meant survival. For the men at Ridgewell, Big Week was not a single event, but a test of endurance, an attempt to maintain operational readiness under impossible strain. The hangars smelled of fuel, sweat, and frost, and the roar of engines rarely stopped. Each departure left behind a silence heavy with uncertainty. No one could know which bombers would return and which would not. Yet by some combination of discipline, courage, and sheer persistence, the 381st kept flying. Their work at Ridgewell exemplified the rhythm of the Allied air war, industrial precision intertwined with human endurance. It was a cooperation of hundreds of anonymous specialists that kept the flying fortresses in the sky. They were electricians, sheet metal workers, armorers, radio technicians, and mechanics, all performing a ritual of repair that repeated every night. Without them, the strategic vision of daylight bombing would have remained nothing more than theory. Their labor turned that theory into thunder rolling across German skies. Dawn broke cold and colorless over the fields of Essex on February 22, 1944. The frost still clung to the edges of the runways at RAF Ridgewell, and the heavy breath of engines idling in the distance mixed with the mist that drifted above the ground. It was the third day of what the crews now called Big Week, the great offensive against Germany's aircraft industry. For men of the 381st Bomb Group, the morning began like every other, a race against time, fatigue, and the bitter cold. 20B, 17 flying fortresses were scheduled to launch within the hour, each loaded with nearly 6,000 pounds of bombs destined for the industrial centers of central Germany. In the maintenance area, teams of ground crew moved between aircraft in near silence, communicating through gestures and brief shouts drowned by the hum of auxiliary power units. The routine had become second nature. Check oil levels, inspect control surfaces, verify fuel pressure, secure bomb racks. Each task was performed in sequence, because deviation meant delay, and delay could throw off the entire formation schedule. The 381 Estes mission order that morning called for a takeoff window measured in minutes. Precision on the ground mirrored the precision expected in the air. As the crews prepared one of the lead aircraft of 534th Squadron, a faint but unmistakable smell of gasoline drifted beneath the port wing. One of the senior mechanics, a staff sergeant in his late 20s, crouched to investigate. The ground beneath the aircraft was damp and glistening, a thin line of high-octane fuel seeping from a coupling on the main feed line. It was not an uncommon problem. In the freezing weather, metal contracted just enough to weaken the seal between fittings. A loose connection could vent fuel vapor into the slipstream, creating both a fire hazard and a risk of losing pressure to the engines at altitude. The rules were clear. No aircraft with a suspected fuel leak was to take off under any circumstances. But there was no luxury of time. The engines were scheduled to start in 15 minutes. Crew chiefs moved between bombers confirming readiness. Truck engines growled as they towed bomb carts off the field. The group commander expected every aircraft airborne by 8:30. If even one bomber failed to start, the integrity of the formation would suffer. The staff sergeant knew that this single leak, barely a few drops a minute, could ground the aircraft and force the entire squadron to compensate in the air. He called for the fuel lines to be depressurized and power shut off, following the standard safety procedure outlined in the 8th Air Force Maintenance Manual. Two assistants held lamp steady as he removed the access panel and traced the source of the leak. The fitting had lost its sealing washer, likely compressed beyond tolerance after weeks of vibration and cold. Spare parts were kept in storage lockers across the field, but retrieving one could take half an hour, and the aircraft was already due at the end of the taxi line. In the maintenance pits, improvisation was often a matter of experience. The sergeant knew there was an identical fitting on a nearby aircraft still awaiting an engine replacement, grounded for at least another day. He crossed the tarmac, tools in hand, and removed the unused gasket from the idle plane. Within minutes, he was back beneath the wing, threading the replacement into place. His gloves were soaked through and stiff with cold. He worked methodically, applying sealant compound from a tin warmed inside his jacket, tightening each bolt in sequence to ensure equal pressure along the joint. Everything he did followed regulation procedure, but the speed with which he moved came from instinct built over months of exhaustion and repetition. Around him, Engines began to start in staggered bursts, the air shaking with the rhythmic thunder of propellers spinning to life. The pressure test came next. He reconnected the fuel line and signaled for the auxiliary pump to engage. The gauge held steady. No leaks, no vapor. The smell of gasoline was gone, replaced by the acrid bite of exhaust from nearby engines. He closed the panel and marked the repair in the logbook with a quick note. Replace washer, fuel line, port wing, knowing that no one beyond his section would ever read it. Up the line, the flight crews were already climbing aboard. They moved with a quiet tension, faces pale in the early light, oxygen masks slung over their shoulders. The mechanic stepped back as the crew chief of the aircraft arrived, giving a curt nod. The engines roared to full power one after another, the four propellers blurring into silver discs. For a moment, the sergeant stood in the wash of the exhaust, watching the condensation trail sweep across the tarmac. Then he stepped away, tools still in hand, as the bomber rolled forward into position. There was no applause, no recognition, and no time to reflect. The takeoff schedule held. The group would depart on time. The aircraft he had just repaired joined the taxi queue, its navigation lights flashing red and green in the mist. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like every other flying fortress on the field. But beneath its left wing, a few turns of a wrench in a borrowed gasket had quietly averted disaster and preserved precision of mission that stretched across the continent. Engines came alive across the airfield in a rolling wave of sound. The thunder built gradually, each ignition overlapping the next until Ridgewell vibrated with mechanical fury. Exhaust smoke drifted low to the ground, mixing with frost and the pale light of morning. The bomber that had nearly been grounded was now fully awake, its four right 1820 engines turning at a steady rhythm. Each pulse of propeller sent a vibration through the earth, and the mechanic felt it in his boots as he crouched to make his final checks. He moved through the last steps of procedure as the crew completed theirs. Every action practiced at the point of instinct. The pressure reading stabilized. The fuel gauge needle held firm, indicating a sealed system. The faint smell of gasoline that had lingered earlier was gone, replaced by the heavy scent of burned oil and cold exhaust. He pressed a gloved hand along the panel he had closed only minutes earlier. The metal was warm now from the friction of the engines. No vibration, no trace of moisture. The repair had worked. What began as a leak threatening the mission was now another silent victory written in grease and precision. He slipped the earphones of the ground intercom set over his cap, listening not to voices but to the tone of the engines themselves. The compressors whined in perfect synchronization. The sound told him more than any gauge. These men developed an almost musical sense for machinery, an ability to detect imbalance through rhythm rather than instruments. It was a skill born not from manuals or classrooms, but from endless repetition in all weather, under pressure, under exhaustion. It was intuition forged by fatigue. The crew chief gave the signal for the pre-flight sequence. The mechanic watched the movements like a conductor following an orchestra. The flight engineer leaned out a hatch, giving a thumbs up as the pilot advanced the throttles. The propeller wash whipped across the tarmac, sending grit into the air. The noise was overwhelming. Yet to those who work here, it was a heartbeat of survival. Every note of that mechanical roar meant another aircraft ready, another mission possible, another chance to strike back. When the engines reached full power for systems check, the ground crew took their positions along the safety lines. The mechanic stepped a few paces back, eyes fixed on the left wing where he had worked. He watched for the telltale shimmer of vapor or the flash of an unstable connection, but there was nothing, only the steady rhythm of the engines and the faint tremor of the ground beneath his feet. The gauges in the cockpit reported steady manifold pressure, consistent with the readings he had taken below. The aircraft was cleared for taxi. An officer approached with a readiness form, a checklist confirming that the bomber was fit for flight. The mechanic wiped his hands on a rag before signing his initials beside the maintenance log number. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of trust. Once that paper left his hand, the aircraft was officially his responsibility no longer. From that moment on, it belonged to the air crew and the sky. He stepped aside as the pilot's window slid open and the engines increased their pitch. The vibration grew deeper, shaking loose ice from the edges of the runway. Mechanics lined up at the edges of the dispersal area, raising their arms to signal clear paths. The bomber began to move, rolling slowly out of its stand, the glint of morning sun catching on its aluminum skin. The mechanic stood still, head tilted, listening until the rhythm of the engines faded into the distance. Only when the sound merged with the collective thunder of the other aircraft did he allow himself to relax. The leak had been stopped, the pressure held, and the mission would depart on schedule. Around him, the field was a blur of motion, crews shouting, trucks moving, engines roaring, but his world had shrunk to the fading echo of those four synchronized motors. To anyone else it was noise. To him it was proof of success, the voice of a machine he had helped bring back to life. That sound was his reward, louder and more meaningful than any decoration. It carried with it the knowledge that somewhere, hours later, when that aircraft was flying above a continent torn by war, it would still be running clean and steady because of what happened in these few minutes before dawn. When the readiness officer signed off the final dispatch order, the mechanic remained where he was, staring down the runway. He knew that no one would remember the moment, and no report would mention the repair. But in the invisible chain that connected ground to sky, his work had become one vital link. Every second he had saved could mean the difference between survival and loss, between a crew returned to base and a telegram sent home. The engines roared again as another aircraft taxied past, its prop wash tearing at his jacket. He smiled faintly and turned back to the next machine waiting in line. There were always more to fix, more to prepare, and never enough time. The formation of 20B-17 flying fortresses lifted from the frozen runways of Ridgewell just after sunrise. Their engines howled in perfect unison as they clawed to the low fog that rolled in from the North Sea. The countryside below was still half asleep, the fields dusted with frost, the villages hidden under a gray mist. The bombers rose into the pale sky, their silver wings catching faint reflections of dawn. Within minutes they had formed a tight box formation, heading east toward the enemy coastline. Their destination was Oschersleben, a name every man in the 8th Air Force had come to know. It was one of the main centers of Focke-Wulf fighter production, a target so vital that the Germans defended it with everything they had. The flight to the continent began uneventfully. The crews climbed to altitude, leveling off near 25,000 feet, with a cold bit through their gloves and oxygen masks froze to their faces. The pilots adjusted their throttles to hold formation, watching for the glint of sunlight on the wingtips of neighboring aircraft. Below them stretched a blanket of cloud, serene and deceptive, concealing the occupied lands that bristled with anti-aircraft batteries. For a brief hour, the bombers moved through a quiet, icy world that seemed untouched by war. Then the first burst of flak appeared, small black flowers blooming in the white sky. The Germans had expected them. Radar had tracked the formation since it crossed the Dutch coast, and by the time the fortresses reached the outskirts of Oschersleben, the air was alive with fire. Flak shells burst in precise clusters, throwing jagged shards of steel through the air. The bombers rocked under the impact, their aluminum skins hammered by invisible fists. The crews held their course, each pilot trusting the geometry of formation to shield them. For the men inside, every minute felt like an hour. The sound of explosions outside mixed with the rattle of spent shell casings hitting the floor. From the ground, the sky must have looked like a slow-moving storm of silver dots. German gunners poured everything they had into the air. The bombers pressed on, maintaining the rigid discipline that defined daylight bombing. The lead navigator, the 381st, adjusted his course to line up the target. Factories on the southern edge of the town that produced the FW-190's engines and fuselages. Bomb bays opened in perfect sequence, and the first wave dropped its payload. Columns of smoke began to rise, merging with the black plumes of flak. The second and third elements followed, releasing their bombs over the aiming point with remarkable accuracy. The escorting P-47 Thunderbolts circled above, diving occasionally to disrupt attacking fighters, though heavy cloud cover limited visibility. Despite German resistance, the 381st completed its run and turned west for the long journey home. The wind shifted, strong and biting, slowing their progress. Some bombers limped in formation with engines feathered or controls damaged, but none broke away. Fuel levels dropped faster than expected as the headwind grew stronger. Crews switched tanks and adjusted mixture controls to stretch every gallon. After nearly 8 hours in the air, the white cliffs of England appeared through the haze, a sight that always brought a surge of quiet relief. Ridgewell's control tower began to call in returning aircraft, counting them by their tail numbers as they appeared one by one out of clouds. The first to land came in low, its landing gear creaking, its fuselage riddled with holes. Ground crews raced forward with fire trucks and ambulances, but most of the damage was superficial. Flak scars shattered plexiglass, torn fabric control surfaces. One by one, the rest followed, touching down on the wet runway, their engines coughing as throttles closed. Mechanics and armorers stood at the edge of the field, scanning the horizon for the last of the formation. Finally, the bomber repaired that morning came into view. It approached slower than the others, one engine sputtering slightly from altitude strain, but still steady. Its wheels kissed the runway with a hiss of vaporized water, and the aircraft rolled to a stop near its dispersal bay. The fuel gauges showed nearly empty tanks. The crew had brought it home on the last fumes. When the engine shut down, the airfield fell into relative silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. The airmen climbed out, faces pale with exhaustion, uniforms streaked with sweat and soot. They spoke little, their movements automatic as they handed in their debrief forms and walked toward the mess hall for coffee. The ground crew moved in immediately, surrounding the bomber with ladders, hoses, and tool carts. They examined the wing, the very spot that had threatened to end the mission before it began. The seal was intact, the metal dry. The quick repair had held under 8 hours of vibration, cold, and flak. The mechanic, who had made it, stood a few steps away, watching the aircraft taxi in. To him it looked no different from any other, dented, scorched, weary, but alive. He counted the men stepping down from the hatch, all of them safe. None of them knew how close their flight had come to being canceled that morning. To them, the bomber was just another machine that had done its duty. To him, it was a quiet confirmation that precision on the ground could decide the outcome in the sky. As darkness settled again over Ridgewell, the crews prepared for another mission, but for a brief moment, the field felt at peace. The day's work had ended as it began, with a mechanic standing beneath a wing, his hands blackened with oil, listening to an engine as it cooled, knowing that tomorrow it would have to start all over again. The events of that February morning never appeared in newspapers or official communiques. No reporter stood on the airfield to record the moment, and no camera captured the mechanic's repair beneath the wing. Yet it was precisely these invisible actions that allowed the 381st Bomb Group to endure the relentless tempo of Big Week. While other units struggled with attrition rates that stripped them of half their operational strength, Ridgewell squadrons maintained a remarkable record of readiness. Their ability to launch full formations day after day was not the result of luck or abundance of equipment, but a methodical precision practiced by hundreds of men who worked unseen in the cold. Across the 8th Air Force, ground crews like those at Ridgewell formed the hidden architecture of the Allied air campaign. Their discipline and maintenance set the standard for the bomber offensive. The American system of industrial warfare relied not only on the mass production of aircraft, but also on the consistency of those who sustained them. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a complex machine of more than 350,000 parts, and its reliability depended on an equally complex network of training, procedure, and manpower. The men at Ridgewell became experts in preventive maintenance, identifying weaknesses before they caused failure, improvising solutions from limited supplies, and learning to complete major repairs in hours rather than days. This efficiency gave the 381st a crucial advantage. During Big Week, the group flew continuous missions with minimal cancellations, contributing to the cumulative blow that crippled the Luftwaffe's production capacity. While individual acts of heroism in the air captured the imagination of the public, it was a consistency on the ground that made those missions possible. Historical reports from the Air Force Historical Research Agency later noted that Ridgewell's maintenance turnaround rate ranked among the best in the 8th Air Force. Each aircraft averaged less than 8 hours of ground repair between sorties, an extraordinary figure given the weather, damage, and fatigue of constant operations. The influence of these practices spread beyond one airfield. Technical officers from other bases visited Ridgewell to study its workflow, its spare part management, and its scheduling system. The 381 Estes ground crews had refined a cooperative model in which specialists from different sections, armament, electrical, hydraulic, and fuel systems, worked side by side rather than in isolation. Their integrated approach reduced downtime and established a template later adopted across other bomber groups. By the spring of 1944, this collaborative method had become standard throughout the 8th Air Force, contributing to the sustained bombing capacity that supported the Normandy invasion only months later. When the war ended, the lessons learned at places like Ridgewell were not forgotten. The U.S. Army Air Forces compiled detailed studies of ground maintenance efficiency, citing examples from the 381st as evidence that standardized procedure combined with skilled improvisation could dramatically improve sortie rates. These studies influenced the post-war reorganization of American air power, forming the backbone of what would become the United States Air Force's maintenance doctrine. Even in civilian aviation, echoes of Ridgewell's methods appeared in peacetime practices, scheduled inspections, modular component swaps, and rapid turnaround procedures that mirrored wartime necessity. For the men themselves, however, there were no public honors. The ground crews returned home quietly, their wartime achievements largely unrecognized outside the circle of those who had served with them. But within the 8th Air Force community, their reputation endured. Veterans of the 381st later recalled that their group rarely failed to put a full complement of aircraft in the air, even under the harshest conditions. In reunion records decades later, pilots and navigators often credited their survival to the boys on the line, a phrase that encapsulated the respect earned by those who never left the ground. The wider impact of their work extended beyond Ridgewell's perimeter. Their mastery of logistics, maintenance, and procedure became part of the institutional memory of Allied air power. It demonstrated that victory in the skies was not achieved solely by courage or technology, but by a culture of reliability sustained by ordinary men who understood that precision was its own form of heroism. The quiet competence of these mechanics, electricians, and armorers ensured that missions launched on time, engines ran true, and aircraft returned home. In the vast machinery of war, they provided the rhythm that kept it running. When the war finally ended, the roar of aircraft engines gave way to a silence few at Ridgewell had ever known. The runways, once alive with motion, grew quiet. The rows of B-17s that had thundered skyward for nearly 2 years were dismantled, scrapped, or flown away to other airfields for decommissioning. The men who had kept them flying packed their toolkits and duffel bags, boarded transport planes, and began their slow journey home. For many of them, the transition from war to peace was not marked by ceremony, but by a quiet return to ordinary life. They became automobile mechanics, factory engineers, teachers, and farmers. Their wartime skills, diagnosing a failing engine by sound, improvising repair from whatever was at hand, managing exhaustion without complaint, became invisible threads woven into the fabric of post-war America. Few of them spoke much about what they had done. When veterans told stories of the air war, they spoke of the pilots who braved flak and fighters, of missions over Berlin or Munich, of the long journey home on 3 engines. The men who had worked in the shadows beneath those aircraft rarely added their voices. They carried a different kind of memory. The feel of cold metal before dawn, the smell of gasoline mixed with oil and frost, the rhythm of wrenches echoing in hangars long before the crews arrived. Their victories were measured not in medals, but in the sound of engines running smoothly at takeoff. As decades passed, historians and museums began to recognize that the air war could not be understood through flight crews alone. The archives of the 8th Air Force contain thousands of reports signed by men whose names never appeared in combat citations. Maintenance officers, ground engineers, and technical sergeants who ensured that aircraft met every standard of readiness. Restoration groups in Britain and the United States, rebuilding surviving flying fortresses, often discovered handwritten notes and initials on old panels, traces of those anonymous craftsmen. In time, museum plaques began to change. Alongside the names of pilots and bombardiers, new inscriptions appeared. Ground crew. It was a simple phrase, but it restored balance to a story that had long been incomplete. At memorials dedicated to the 8th Air Force, visitors can still see the faces of those who worked at places like Ridgewell. Photographs show men in stained coveralls standing proudly in front of aircraft whose names are now legendary. Mary Ruth, Sleepy Time Gal, My Devotion. They stand not as background figures, but as equals to the crews they served. Their expressions are weary, determined, and unmistakably human. For every flight that left England, there were dozens of hands behind it, unseen yet essential. The legacy of these men extended beyond remembrance. The post-war aviation industry drew heavily on the discipline and procedural rigor established by wartime ground crews. Civilian airlines adopted their maintenance schedules, inspection checklists, and safety protocols. The culture of precision that had been born out of necessity in the mud and cold of wartime England became the foundation of modern air travel reliability. The world that learned to fly in peace did so on the shoulders of those who had learned to repair under fire. In later years, veterans of the 381st Bomb Group gathered at reunions, often held in small American towns far removed from the English airfields where they had served. They brought faded photographs and yellowed mission logs, and among the stories of combat were quiet acknowledgments of the men on the ground. Pilots who had flown through flak over Oschersleben or Berlin spoke with gratitude of the mechanics who had trusted them with their work. They knew that each successful return began hours before takeoff, with someone's frozen fingers tightening the last bolt. At Ridgewell itself, the remnants of the wartime base eventually became farmland again, though a small museum now occupies part of the old control tower. Visitors can see fragments of aircraft logbooks and the simple tools used by the maintenance crews. The displays tell the story not of glory, but of endurance, a story of men who fought gravity, weather, and fatigue with equal courage. Their labor has outlasted the machines they served, preserved not in flight, but in memory. Their story stands as a reminder that flight begins on the ground. The triumph of the air war was not just a product of engines and wings, but of those who trusted their craft enough to let others take it skyward. In a history filled with aces and heroes, the ground crew remain its quiet conscience, proof that heroism does not always rise above the clouds, but often kneels beneath them with a wrench in hand. Courage, in the air war over Europe, had many forms. It was easy to recognize in the pilots who flew through flak and fire, or in the gunners who stood their ground against attacking fighters. But there was another kind of courage, quieter, steadier, built not on defiance of danger but on the mastery of duty. It lived in the men who worked beneath the wings, whose battles were fought against fatigue, frost, and time itself. Their heroism did not depend on breaking orders or taking reckless chances. It existed in precision of their actions when every second mattered and every mistake could cost lives. The ground crews of the 381st Bomb Group embodied a truth often overlooked in wartime narratives. That discipline is its own form of bravery. They did not face the enemy directly, yet their resolve was unshakable. They met each dawn with the same ritual of labor, tightening bolts, checking pressure, wiping frost from metal, and they did so knowing that their success would pass unseen. Theirs was a courage expressed through constancy, a determination to perform one's task perfectly in a world that had lost all sense of certainty. In the hierarchy of war, their position seemed humble, but the moral weight of their work was immense. Every bomber that left the ground carried within it the sum of their care, their steadiness, and their judgment. A single misaligned fitting or overlooked detail could destroy an aircraft and its crew. Yet despite exhaustion and fear, they continued to work with the calm exactness that defined true professionalism. They represented the moral center of a technological war. Proof that machinery could only serve humanity when guided by human conscience. Their labor revealed another paradox of war, that the most decisive acts often happened in silence. The enemy never saw them. History rarely mentioned them. But the outcome of entire campaigns depended on their invisible efficiency. The great offensive of Big Week, the air battles over Germany, the slow disintegration of the Luftwaffe, all of it relied not only on the courage of men in flight, but on the reliability of those who prepared the machines to fly. Their contribution was not spectacular, but it was enduring. The ethics of their work extended beyond the war itself. In their devotion, precision lay a lesson about responsibility, the understanding that even in chaos, one's smallest action can preserve order. The mechanic who tightened a single bolt correctly did more than ensure an engine's safety. He affirmed the principle of care in a time built on destruction. It was an assertion that even within the machinery of war, integrity could survive. In that sense, their craft became a quiet act of resistance against the dehumanization of total conflict. When the first rumble of engines rose over Ridgewell each morning, it was more than the sound of machines preparing for battle. It was a sound born of trust. Trust between those who built and those who flew, between the hands that maintained and the hearts that believed. The vibration that shook the airfield at dawn carried the echo of their unseen victory. It said that in a world collapsing under the weight of war, some men still chose to create, to maintain, and to protect. Their legacy reached beyond Ridgewell's fields and into the post-war world. The same precision that had sustained bombers in combat became the foundation for peace. In aviation safety, in engineering standards, in the quiet belief that perfection, pursued without vanity, could preserve life. What they left behind was not merely a record of sorties or statistics of repair. They left an example of how humanity endures, not through grand gestures or sacrifice alone, but through the daily, disciplined act of doing one's duty with care and conscience. In the end, their courage was not the kind that filled headlines, but it was the kind that kept history moving. They stood in the cold, surrounded by noise and urgency, and turned wrenches with steady hands. Every morning when the first engines roared above Ridgewell, it was not only the sound of departure, it was the echo of their faith, their endurance, and their quiet triumph over machinery of destruction. It was, in the purest sense, the sound of victory.